For more than 3 decades, Saddam Hussein governed Iraq with absolute control, imposing obedience through wars, repression, and an extended surveillance system in every corner of the country. Under his command, large-scale military offensives were launched, prisons were filled with opponents, and purges were executed that even reached members of his inner circle. Power functioned as an instrument created to guarantee his permanence, sustained by violence and fear. Every gesture was designed to project dominance, from statues erected in squares to official broadcasts that constantly repeated his image. The cult of his personality reached a level where loyalty was confused with survival. That authority began to break when foreign troops entered Baghdad in April of 2003. Territorial control vanished, and the symbols of authority were torn down in front of the cameras. With his fall, the trials began. Was it his brutality that led him to the end, or the absolute confidence that he would never be defeated? Childhood between bullets, the fatherless boy who dreamed of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein came into the world in April of 1937 in a dusty corner of Tikrit. His father had died or disappeared before he was born, leaving his widowed mother with another son in her arms. In the midst of that precariousness, she decided to hand over the newborn to her brother's family. The child was raised in a different home, under the tutelage of his uncle Khairallah Tulfa, an unemployed teacher who had been expelled from the army after participating in a nationalist uprising. The atmosphere was harsh. The little one grew up amidst shouts, strict orders, and a constant narrative about enemies that had to be defeated. There was no room for tenderness or games. His mother, after remarrying, reclaimed him years later. The child did not want to return, but was forced to do so. In that new environment, the treatment worsened. His stepfather denied him affection, beat him, and on more than one occasion tried to get rid of him completely. Saddam escaped several times and each time returned to his uncle. Khairallah's figure became dominant. By his side, he learned to be silent, to endure, not to cry. At 10 years of age, Saddam could barely read. His family environment was poor, his community distrusted him, and the teachers saw him as a hostile boy. It was his uncle who insisted on sending him to study in Baghdad. He managed to get him accepted into the primary school south of the capital. The transfer represented a definitive break with his mother and his stepfather. In Baghdad, the child stayed at relatives' home, and from the first day showed a closed and defiant attitude. He did not speak with the other children. He carried a knife on his belt, slept with it, and threatened to use it if anyone bothered him. The teachers noticed his rejection of all authority figures. They punished him frequently. Saddam did not respond. He only observed. He learned to move without being seen, to keep silent, to listen to everything. Street fights were constant. Every time someone mocked him for coming from Tikrit, he responded with punches. The young man grew up under the wing of Uncle Khairallah, who was gradually resuming his public activity after years of repression. From his internal exile, he continued to cultivate a deep hatred against the Hashemite monarchy, especially against King Faisal II and his British allies. Every night he spoke of betrayal, surrender, decadence. Saddam listened without blinking. He learned to associate the faces of the rulers with the abandonment, poverty, and humiliation he had experienced. He still did not fully understand the terms, but he memorized names and dates. Khairallah spoke with passion, showed newspaper clippings, recited entire speeches. Saddam barely spoke, but his behavior showed that he was absorbing every word. His character became more rigid. He began to avoid everything that reminded him of weakness. He rejected displays of affection, refused to participate in school activities, preferred to walk alone through the alleys of Baghdad rather than play with other children. Violence seemed natural to him. During adolescence, he changed schools several times. His academic record was discreet. His grades did not stand out, but his presence made itself known. He always carried the same dry demeanor, the same fixed gaze. Some teachers feared correcting him. He did not openly insult or disobey, but his silence was threatening. The other students learned to avoid him. He had one single close friend, a young man also from Tikrit. With him, he shared lunches and sporadic conversations. During breaks, he preferred to sit far away. Sometimes he read nationalist pamphlets. His uncle gave him books marked with underlined sentences. He spoke to him about the history of Iraq, about its enemies, about its lost greatness. Saddam took notes. He never questioned anything. During those years, Iraq lived in constant tension. The monarchy maintained power with foreign support, but opposing voices increased. In Baghdad, rumors about conspiracies and rebellions were frequent. Khairallah moved contacts, sent messages, wrote proclamations. Saddam observed every movement. He did not yet participate, but he stayed close. Each visit to Tikrit reminded him of what he had left behind: a childhood marked by abandonment, a dismembered family, a distant maternal figure, and an environment that only responded with blows. His only stable structure was his uncle's discourse, repeated each day with more intensity. In that closed ideological universe, Saddam found a sense of belonging. He finished high school with effort, without excelling in knowledge or skills, although his teachers recognized that he was disciplined, constant, and always met deadlines. He never missed class nor submitted work late, and some described him as someone who seemed like an adult trapped in the body of a young man. Towards the end of his school years, he began to take an interest in history books and biographies of military figures. He inquired about campaigns, searched for old maps, and copied entire speeches without anyone knowing if he understood everything he read, although his memory was exact. He had entire sentences archived and recited them at unexpected moments, even imitating the gestures and intonation of the characters he admired. He did not seek to appear like one more student, but rather to project himself as a leader. His entry into high school was not easy. He lacked outstanding grades or formal support, but his uncle insisted until he managed to open the way for him. In that new scenario, Saddam maintained his usual routine. He spoke little, complied with rigor, and remained aloof, although for the first time he began to make decisions on his own. He rejected rules he did not understand and challenged teachers, not out of academic interest, but out of impulse. He did not seek to learn, but to impose his presence. At home, he isolated himself for hours, copying nationalist speeches that he would then recite alone in front of the mirror, under the watchful eye of Khairallah, who observed him with pride and growing caution. He knew that his nephew was not like the others. He did not seek affection, did not form bonds, and did not show any doubt. From an early age, he began to feel attracted to stories of armed struggle. He sought information about local figures who had confronted the British, cut out articles about clandestine movements, and learned the most repeated slogans by heart. His vision of the world was rigid. There were only allies or traitors. The monarchy symbolized corruption. His enemies were martyrs. Although he did not yet have his own role in that narrative, he was already training to be part of it. Every choice, every text he read, every gesture he imitated was part of a path he believed inevitable. His personal biography pushed him relentlessly: the disappearance of his father, the rejection by his stepfather, the severity of his environment, the uncle's absorbing devotion, social contempt, and constant violence had traced that path without allowing him deviations. Upon reaching the last stage of his adolescence, his figure began to be recognized in Baghdad. Some identified him by his quiet character and his origin in Tikrit, others by his closeness to nationalist circles. Although he did not actively participate, he attended meetings, paid attention to speeches, and asked precise questions. No one yet saw him as a leader, but everyone noticed his inflexible discipline. He was always present. He carried the same notebook, kept the same serious face, seemed older than he was. His uncle continued to pave the way for him. He introduced him to contacts, assigned him readings, taught him to move carefully. Saddam took on each assignment as a silent examination. He left no room for improvisation. He observed everything, noted it down, retained it. Upon finishing high school, he still did not speak of power or concrete ambitions. He did not mention positions or parties. He only repeated obsessive phrases about betrayals, greatness, and sacrifice. He said he wanted to study law not out of academic vocation, but because he was interested in laws that could protect the use of force. His life continued to revolve around the same elements: an unadorned room, underlined books, narratives about enemies, select newspapers, and occasional visits to his hometown. The fatherless child had become a young man who read war biographies seeking answers. Throughout that process, there was no room for affectionate gestures, doubts, or breaks, only a cold and calculated sequence of steps that led him toward a destiny he had not yet named, but which he already considered inevitable. The coup of '63, Saddam emerges from the shadows. At the beginning of 1957, still without reaching 20 years of age, Saddam began to associate with the clandestine groups that circulated pamphlets and discussed revolutionary ideas in closed spaces. The Ba'ath Party was barely making its way in Iraq without a solid structure, with scarce military presence and few stable figures. By then, Qasim's regime had cut its ties with the communists, which allowed the Ba'athists to fill that void and extend their networks in urban areas. Saddam, freshly out of the guardianship of his uncle Khairallah, found in the party's discipline a refuge from the instability of the streets. In Baghdad, he met Fawzi al-Qaisi, an organizer of weekly meetings in discreet dwellings, who introduced him to the handling of manifestos and the political rhetoric of the party. At first, the senior cadres looked at him with suspicion due to his youth and lack of training, but his constant obedience, his total alignment with the internal line, and his ability to act without hesitation earned him a place within the movement. Soon he received minor tasks such as the transfer of documents and pamphlets, and then surveillance duties over cells suspected of infiltration. With that advancement, the young man from Tikrit began to integrate into the spaces reserved for internal security, where more decisive actions were discussed. 2 years later, in the first months of 1959, the political scenario had become more hostile. The government kept the Ba'athists marginalized, which led sectors of the party to organize a plan to eliminate Qasim. The meetings were held in different houses, with the participation of allied officers and figures such as Uday Yassin, in charge of the escape routes. Saddam was chosen as part of the group that would execute the operation. The plan consisted of intercepting the convoy of the head of state in the Al-Rashid area, firing from strategic points, and fleeing before the escorts could react. On the appointed day, the attackers distributed themselves in the planned location and opened fire when the vehicle appeared. Qasim was wounded but managed to survive. One of the aggressors was shot down during the shootout and several were arrested. Saddam, hit by a shot in the leg, managed to escape by crossing alleys, changing clothes, and taking refuge in friendly dwellings. Thanks to a network of sympathizers, he was first transferred to Tikrit and then north until crossing the Syrian border. That silent escape turned him into a respected figure within the party, although his name did not appear in the official reports. In Damascus, he was received by Ba'athist emissaries who helped him settle in and communicated to the leadership the details of his participation during the assassination attempt. In mid-1960, while in exile, Saddam was sent to Cairo to continue his training, where he came into contact with political exiles from different Arab countries and attended ideological discussion meetings. Although he avoided speaking in public, he earned the respect of his comrades for his punctuality, his willingness to undertake logistical tasks, and his reserved manner of behaving. In party sessions in Egypt, he did not hold relevant positions, but everyone knew that he had participated directly in the assassination attempt against Qasim, which conferred a certain prestige among youth circles. During that time, he maintained correspondence with Khairallah, who informed him about the internal situation in Iraq and conveyed messages from figures close to the party. When the regime intensified persecutions, several exiled militants began to return to Syria, where the Ba'ath had strengthened, although Saddam preferred to remain in Egypt until conditions were right to return. The year 1963 marked a decisive turn, and in February, after a series of internal conspiracies, the Ba'ath Party managed to seize power in Iraq through a military coup supported by some sectors of the army. Saddam returned to the country with false documents and was immediately incorporated into the new security apparatus, where his role, though still discreet in public terms, was key in the restructuring of political prisons. He participated in interrogations, drafted reports on suspects, and helped reorganize surveillance files. In this context, the party developed new, more systematic repression techniques than those applied previously, and Saddam demonstrated a particular ability to identify weaknesses in detainees' statements. During that period, ties with figures like Hamdani and Alani were strengthened, allowing him to ascend rapidly in the internal structure of the control system. Despite the initial success, the party's situation rapidly deteriorated due to divisions among military factions, distrust towards civilian Ba'athists, and struggles for control of ministries, which led to increasing tensions. Saddam, who did not hold ministerial positions, witnessed these disputes and adopted a cautious stance, avoiding hasty alliances. During the following months, the communists began to reorganize, and nationalist sectors tried to regain their influence, until in November of 1963 the military displaced the Ba'ath from the government and restored a more conservative order. Saddam was arrested during the raids and transferred to a prison in Baghdad, where he remained incommunicado for several weeks. During his confinement, he was subjected to interrogations that did not produce relevant confessions, though they did mark his character. He was not allowed to receive visitors and was kept in severe conditions along with other party detainees. In 1964, he managed to escape from prison with the help of a sympathetic guard. The operation was organized by a small Ba'ath cell that was still operating clandestinely. Once out, Saddam took refuge in safe houses and re-established contact with the party's main leaders. It was then that he began to draft internal documents, where he proposed improvements in infiltration methods and suggested parallel structures to resist future purges. That same year, he was incorporated into the party's regional bureau, although his public presence remained minimal. Instead of giving speeches or participating in rallies, he dedicated himself to administrative tasks, organizing lists of reliable members, evaluating the loyalty of new recruits, and developing contingency plans in case of repression. By 1965, the clandestine Ba'ath apparatus was more consolidated. Saddam coordinated the work of different cells in Baghdad and Tikrit, supervising shipments of printed material, discreet meetings, and counter-surveillance tasks. He maintained permanent contact with Kairala, who provided him with political cover and resources. Trust in his operational capacity grew so much that he was designated to be part of a committee responsible for reorganizing communication channels with Syria. From that position, he had access to reserved information about possible future alliances with sectors of the army. During that time, his influence increased silently, without occupying visible positions, but gaining authority in every internal decision. In the first months of 1966, when the party was trying to recover from a new wave of repression, Saddam proposed restructuring the security systems and applying more rigorous filters to new members in committee meetings that took place in discreet apartments and were attended by key figures of the party, who saw in him someone willing to take risks. Although some considered him too strict, his ability to maintain internal discipline made him indispensable. As preparations intensified for an eventual return to power, his name began to appear more frequently in the party's internal reports, although he was not yet a public face nor a national figure. He remained in the shadows, weaving networks, evaluating allies, consolidating structures, and everything indicated that when the moment arrived he would be prepared to assume a different role, although he was not yet emerging as the man who would occupy center stage. The Iron President, how he took the throne without firing. When the structure of the Ba'ath Party regained power in 1968, Saddam occupied a strategic place in the internal apparatus, but the official face of the new regime was Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. In the early years, the government's public image was carefully designed to project unity and authority, although real decision-making began to shift towards more restricted committees, where Saddam imposed a different pace. Through meticulous control of the security system and constant vigilance over the civil and military branches of the party, he defined the scope of each member, consolidating his influence without yet occupying the pinnacle. In official speeches, his name was barely mentioned, but in the corridors of power, his presence became increasingly difficult to ignore. With each reorganization, with each discreet dismissal, his network of trust expanded, not through charisma, but through a logic that prioritized obedience, efficiency, and the total absence of doubt. Inside the party, rumors multiplied about closed meetings, duplicated files, and new control mechanisms. Saddam personally supervised appointments in key ministries, the rotation of cadres at intermediate levels, and the ideological training of young cadres who rose quickly. The political bureau ceased to be a space for collective deliberation to become an organ where decisions arrived already formulated, accompanied by dossiers, reports, and arguments that no one dared to question. While al-Bakr occupied the headlines and represented the state in official acts, Saddam articulated a parallel structure from the Revolutionary Command Council, which over time became the true nucleus of power. From there, his signature was what defined appointments, decrees, and internal reorganization plans. He did so without fanfare, without grandiloquent gestures, but with a precision that annulled resistances before they arose. Between 1973 and 1976, the security agencies underwent a silent transformation. New directorates were created, intelligence agencies multiplied, and databases were established that cross-referenced information on officials, military personnel, and local leaders. Saddam was behind each of these changes. Surprise visits to party offices in different provinces became a common practice. His unannounced presence disoriented regional secretaries who knew that a mistake, a hesitation, or an omission in their responses could result in immediate dismissal. These tours not only consolidated his authority, but also allowed him to measure the level of discipline at each level of the apparatus. In parallel, his figure began to occupy a more visible place in the official press. Articles, photographs, and reports presented him as a defender of revolutionary values, a tireless organizer, an architect of unity. The transition to the center stage was not abrupt, but it was constant. By 1977, the signs that the internal balance was shifting were already difficult to conceal. Al-Bakr, though still formally in command, was increasingly absent from decisive meetings. Party communiques began to quote Saddam's statements more frequently, and reports on national projects were presented by his associates. In council sessions, it was he who chaired the tables, distributed documents, and defined the agenda. Others' speeches were brief, almost ceremonial, while he would speak for hours, expounding guidelines, reviewing reports, and correcting errors with a constant tone that needed no raising. His method nullified any room for improvisation. Each intervention was supported by data, each decision included precise argumentation, and each measure responded to a previously organized sequence. During the first half of 1979, the pace accelerated. Al-Bakr's health visibly deteriorated, which facilitated Saddam's moves. In a series of private meetings, Saddam presented him with the need for an orderly transition, without conflict or internal divisions, showing him documents supporting the idea of a planned succession, signed by the main party bodies, and assuring him continuity, stability, and historical recognition. The pressure was discreet but firm. Finally, on the 4th of July, 1979, al-Bakr officially resigned. At the handover ceremony, Saddam appeared serene with a speech that extolled unity, loyalty to revolutionary principles, and the legacy of his predecessor, without mentioning conflicts, without making promises, or raising his voice. He was proclaimed president unanimously, in an atmosphere carefully prepared to project normality. Just a few weeks later, one of the most forceful maneuvers of his ascent occurred. On the 22nd of July of that same year, the party convened an extraordinary meeting in Baghdad, with the main national and regional leaders summoned to the Central Command Hall. Cameras were on, microphones distributed, rows organized by hierarchy. Saddam, now as head of state, took the floor and announced that an internal conspiracy had been discovered. He pulled out a list of names, some of them with decades in the party, others newly ascended, and accused them of treason, of contacts with foreign powers, of jeopardizing the country's stability. His tone was not exalted, but each word carried a weight that paralyzed those present. One by one, those singled out were forced to stand up, to be escorted by guards, to leave without uttering a word, while those remaining next to them did not know whether to applaud or remain silent. No one asked for explanations, no one questioned the documents, no one ever saw the expelled members again. That event marked a before and after. The images were broadcast on national television, carefully edited, repeated for days. The scene of Saddam naming traitors, demanding absolute loyalty, and looking at each member with an intensity no one dared to sustain was etched into the collective consciousness of the party. From then on, purges ceased to be secret and became public acts, recorded lessons. Members knew that any sign of doubt or ambiguous gesture could be interpreted as disloyalty. Meetings ceased to be spaces for discussion and became acts of confirmation, where each intervention had to reinforce what had already been said. In that climate, Saddam's figure began to expand beyond formal bodies. The party committees received orders to reorganize their internal functioning. Decision-making channels were centralized, procedures were refined, and institutional communication criteria were modified. Official publications began to accurately reflect the hierarchical structure, avoiding any ambiguity in the messages. Magazines prioritized reports from the Revolutionary Command Council, communiques from the Political Bureau, and meetings with foreign delegations. It was not an image campaign, but an integral adjustment that consolidated the leadership corps as the sole operational reference within the state apparatus. In the following months, surveillance became more rigorous. Each ministry had party delegates who reported directly to his office. Weekly reports on efficiency, discipline, and ideological attitude became key documents. New evaluation committees were established that cross-referenced data on public statements, administrative behavior, and personal ties. Any discrepancy, however minimal, could trigger a full review. In that environment, meetings began to resemble theatrical acts where every gesture had to be aligned with the will of the leadership. Saddam attended many of these sessions in person, took notes, listened without interrupting, and then gave precise instructions that were executed immediately. No one knew if his presence was a sign of approval or a prelude to an investigation, and that ambiguity was part of the method. By the end of 1979, the party was no longer a collective of ideological cadres, but a machinery oriented towards a single figure. Discipline was confused with obedience, strategy with execution, initiative with fidelity. Saddam did not need to dissolve structures or impose exceptional decrees. It was enough to observe, select, displace, and replace. Every movement was calculated, every gesture measured, every word evaluated before being pronounced. Thus, without having fired a single bullet, without declaring a revolution or altering the constitution, he sat on the throne of absolute power. The Infinite War, Saddam against Khomeini's Iran. The High Command in Baghdad had been analyzing maps, figures, and positions for weeks. Saddam Hussein, now without rivals at the top, considered that the moment had arrived. With the Islamic Revolution still disorganizing the ranks of the Iranian regime and the purge of the Persian army in full swing, the eastern border seemed weakened. Iraq then decided to launch an offensive that was not presented as an invasion, but as a preventive response. The dispenser of authoritarian gestures that already dominated Saddam's style gave way to an open war strategy. Under direct orders, tanks, infantry, and artillery were mobilized towards the dividing line, crossing the Shatt al-Arab with the aim of occupying key territory in southern Iran. The operation was designed to be quick, but the advance stalled within a few weeks. The terrain was hostile, the climate suffocating, and Iranian fighters began to organize high-intensity counterattacks. The campaign that was believed to be short transformed into a military quagmire that forced the mobilization to be extended for years. While propaganda showed Saddam as a firm leader, the front fragmented and defensive lines changed hands again and again. Iraqi border cities were reinforced and converted into resistance trenches. The military command, which had launched the offensive with confidence, began to apply extreme measures to maintain discipline. Hundreds of soldiers were executed for retreating without permission. Saddam took every decision coldly, without accepting internal criticism. He ordered the use of unconventional weaponry at various points on the front, including chemical attacks in rural areas inhabited by civilians. The images did not reach television, but they circulated among diplomats and international agencies. Despite the pressure, the regime systematically denied any involvement. As the conflict dragged on, Baghdad reformulated its narrative. It was no longer about a border correction, but a defense against the religious expansion of the Shiite regime. Saddam constructed a discourse where he presented himself as the protector of the secular Arab world against the clerical fanaticism of Tehran. This new justification fueled official speeches, which were broadcast daily by radio and print media. The leader not only reinforced his image, but also redoubled his control over internal cadres. Officers who showed doubts were sidelined, and commanders who executed orders with rigor received swift promotions. The security apparatus continued to function, now also focused on monitoring morale in the army. Thousands of new soldiers were recruited among inexperienced young people, and basic training was replaced by accelerated instruction oriented towards immediate combat. During the following years, the front mutated into a line of death that stretched for several hundreds of kilometers. The western zone of Iranian territory was bombarded without interruption, and Ayatollah Khomeini's regime responded with human waves in which thousands of adolescents were sent to advance over minefields. Baghdad increased its production of projectiles and reinforced its air fleet with urgent purchases. Military expenses exceeded the anticipated budget, and loans and specific alliances were resorted to in order to keep the machinery operational. Saddam frequently appeared in uniform, visiting hospitals and trenches, always surrounded by cameras. His words were brief, but the images spoke for him. State television constantly broadcast scenes of soldiers cheering his name, while in the rear, burials without ceremony multiplied. Towards 1984, military command reports began to reveal an irreversible stalemate. Despite the massive use of helicopters and armored vehicles, it was not possible to secure key positions. Iranian counterattacks intensified, and the civilian population began to suffer more severely. Several border towns were completely razed, and internal displacements reached unprecedented figures. Diplomatic channels were discreetly activated, but neither side seemed willing to back down. Saddam insisted that victory was possible, although privately he was already analyzing containment scenarios. During the following years, forced recruitment accelerated, and the use of local militias under Ba'ath control expanded, while the educational system was restructured to indoctrinate new generations with a narrative of epic resistance, and the media omitted any reference to fatigue or wear and tear. In 1986, internal reports indicated significant wear and tear in the ranks, accompanied by an abrupt drop in industrial production levels. External restrictions began to affect essential resources, and Saddam ordered direct measures to neutralize any sign of instability. Controls over educational centers were redoubled, and officials with ambiguous positions were identified and removed without formal process. From the central office, a single narrative was promoted in which war reports were modified before being issued, accompanied by martial-toned music and carefully selected phrases. The leadership was presented as the sole guarantor of continuity, but despite official insistence, it was already recognized in sectors of the army that the conflict had stagnated. The offensive had lost direction, and the front was increasingly becoming an immobile line. During the first months of 1988, the situation was untenable. Casualties accumulated, logistical reserves diminished, and signs of exhaustion were visible at all levels. Saddam made the decision to accept a negotiated settlement, and the announcement was not presented as a withdrawal but as a tactical victory that consolidated the country's sovereignty. Official communiques spoke of resistance, firmness, and unity, while internally military structures were reorganized to prevent leaks. The death toll was not published, although international organizations estimated hundreds of thousands between both sides. Baghdad did not allow external evaluations, and all relevant documentation was classified. The conflict closed without ceremony, without processions or grandiloquent speeches. The country had survived, but at a cost that would mark the following decades. Saddam, who had started the war as a confident leader in full control of the state apparatus, now emerged as a hardened leader by experience. His command style had consolidated amidst tragedy, and control over the armed forces became absolute. The war against Iran had left no individual heroes or clear victories, but it had reinforced the cult of his figure, and the country entered a new stage, still unaware that another, more media-intensive confrontation was yet to come. The spoils of the desert, invasion and looting of Kuwait. In early 1990, while sanctions over debt with Arab countries did not cease and the internal economy suffered the ravages of a war without gains, Saddam Hussein focused his discourse on the idea of betrayal and conspiracy. In repeated meetings with high-ranking party officials, he insisted that certain Gulf powers had deliberately sabotaged Iraq's economic stability. It was not just an oil dispute, according to him, but a covert political aggression, and from his inner circle, the idea was promoted that the only way to restore Iraqi leadership was to punish those responsible. In those weeks, the name of Kuwait began to be mentioned with increasing frequency in internal reports and public speeches. For years, the regime's narrative held that Kuwait was merely a portion artificially separated from the Iraqi national body, a legacy of unjust colonial agreements. Added to this were technical accusations against the Kuwaiti monarchy, accused of surreptitiously extracting oil from shared fields on the border. The Iraqi government alleged that these wells were being deliberately drained, and that this action was, in practical terms, an economic aggression. Saddam used this argument to justify an increasingly threatening stance. In conferences with Arab journalists, he hinted that his patience had limits, and in one of these statements, he affirmed that those who attacked Iraq must pay the price. Concurrently, diplomatic meetings between both governments failed, and offers of mediation were interpreted by Baghdad as delaying tactics. According to records from Saddam's circle, his decision was already made. Republican Guard units began moving south in complete silence. There were no prior announcements, and only a limited number of commanders were aware of the final objective. During the last days of July, while negotiations with Kuwaiti delegations were still ongoing, tank convoys were already lining up at strategic points along the border. The operation was conceived as a lightning movement, with no margin for enemy forces to react. At dawn on August 2, troops crossed the line separating both countries and within hours seized the critical points of the small emirate. Kuwaiti defences did not resist the advance, and the royal family escaped to Saudi Arabia. By midday, the capital's streets were under Iraqi military control, and images of soldiers hoisting flags over public buildings were broadcast on Iraqi state channels as proof of immediate domination. Saddam appeared that same day on television, announcing that Kuwait was incorporated into Iraq with full administrative integration and subject to the laws of Baghdad. The operation, presented as liberating, was accompanied by a direct intervention in all key infrastructures. Government offices, banks, warehouses and refineries were taken by special units, while in parallel the propaganda apparatus was activated to reinforce the idea that Iraq had acted in legitimate self-defense. Official statements affirmed that the action responded to decades of provocations and economic looting perpetrated by the Kuwaiti elite, and state television broadcast images of alleged citizens celebrating unification, although external sources questioned the authenticity of those scenes. Despite that, within Iraq, the narrative was unanimous, and the occupation was justified as an act of sovereignty. From the first day, Saddam refused to consider any withdrawal formula. His stance quickly hardened, and the closest ministers supported the decision with a synchronized discourse. In multiple Arab forums, Iraq defended its intervention as part of a nationalist and anti-imperialist cause, and despite the criticism, the Baghdad regime maintained its position without concessions. In the following weeks, the formation of an international coalition began. Under Washington's leadership, more than 30 countries aligned with the declared objective of liberating Kuwait. Troops were deployed in Saudi Arabia, and a total economic blockade was established against Iraq, while Saddam redoubled his rhetoric. He affirmed that it was not a simple territorial dispute, but a conflict between the will of the Arab peoples and the interests of foreign powers, and in his speeches he compared the situation with ancient resistances to colonialism, seeking a heroic parallel to justify his permanence in the occupied emirate. Within the country, the official discourse insisted that Iraq could resist any type of pressure. Rallies were held in support of the leader, and the image of national unity was reinforced, while in schools students were instructed on the legitimacy of Kuwaiti integration. In the streets, however, scarcity began to become evident as the restrictions imposed by the blockade affected the supply of basic goods, although censorship prevented these shortages from being reflected in the press. The dominant narrative remained focused on national dignity and the need to resist international aggression. During that time, Saddam held several meetings with representatives of non-aligned countries in an attempt to break the diplomatic siege. He also issued letters addressed to Arab leaders appealing for regional unity, although none of these efforts altered the coalition's stance. From the Saudi border, foreign forces continued to gather, while in Baghdad, control over the population was strengthened. The arrests of opponents intensified, and official speeches against any dissidents hardened, with the state machinery focused on defending the decision taken. With the passing of the months, tensions reached their peak. The deadlines imposed by the Security Council were met without results, and Saddam refused to yield. The occupation continued while military maneuvers were carried out to consolidate the Iraqi presence in the taken territory, and propaganda insisted that the people of Kuwait were being liberated from the control of a corrupt monarchy. To each international condemnation statement, he responded with accusations of hypocrisy and double standards. In his view, Iraq was being punished for raising its voice against dominant interests. The regime's logic closed in on itself. Withdrawal was not contemplated, nor was any legitimacy recognized in decisions made outside Baghdad. Saddam reinforced the idea that any concession would be an irreversible humiliation, and thus a tense waiting period began, with all actors positioned. In the Iraqi capital, civil defense drills were ordered and speeches were prepared for a possible confrontation. The leader showed no signs of change, and in his inner circle few dared to question the strategy. The reports reaching the palace maintained an optimistic tone, although the signs of isolation were evident. For Saddam Hussein, the control of Kuwait was not just a military action but a symbolic affirmation. He presented himself as a restorer of Arab pride and as a leader willing to face any punishment rather than yield. That stance marked the final measures of an occupation that had begun in a few hours and would soon face a radical outcome. Firestorm, the Gulf War, and the humiliation of Baghdad. On the dawn of the 17th of January of 1991, the skies over Baghdad were illuminated by a flash that did not come from the sun, but from the cruise missiles that slid over the horizon, crossing in silence before impacting with millimeter precision on the structures selected by the Pentagon. Operation Desert Storm had been launched without visible prior warning for the Iraqi High Command, which was still expecting a belated ground offensive or some last-minute negotiation. Instead, what was unleashed was a systematic, calculated and lethal air campaign, which sought from the first minute to disorganize command networks, cut off the capital's power and collapse the regime's defensive capabilities. From their underground bunkers, Saddam Hussein and his generals heard how explosions rumbled in chain, leaving large areas of Baghdad without electricity before the clock struck 3 in the morning. The deployment of Western war technology was overwhelming. In barely 48 hours, the United States and its allies had launched more than 2,000 airstrikes, directed with satellites and real-time electronic surveillance. The Iraqi Air Force, decimated from the start, barely managed to take off a fraction of its aircraft before the runways were rendered unusable. Saddam did not allow an orderly withdrawal or a relocation of his air units, which caused many to be destroyed on the ground without even having taken off. Meanwhile, American intelligence teams monitored every movement within the Iraqi military apparatus, intercepting communications, decoding signals, and adjusting targets according to the pulse of the resistance. The technological superiority was so clear that in some areas, the Iraqi anti-aircraft defenses did not even manage to detect the projectiles until after they had impacted. As the days advanced, the attacks expanded to refineries, radio stations, strategic bridges, command centers, and ammunition depots. The idea was not only to break Iraq's military machinery, but also to undermine the morale of its leaders and completely isolate Saddam from his troops. However, the Iraqi leader showed no signs of surrender and remained silent during the first days without public appearances, taking refuge in unknown places even to his closest circle. Only when television broadcasts were restored in some areas did he briefly reappear in recordings where he was shown calm and defiant towards the aggressors, although the psychological impact was already evident. Many of his officers had lost contact with the chain of command, orders arrived late or not at all, and coordination between divisions was practically non-existent. General Schwarzkopf and his team, aware that a ground invasion could cost many lives, extended the air phase as much as possible. For more than 1 month, the coalition relentlessly bombed more than 1,500 military targets, in addition to other infrastructures considered essential for Iraqi logistics. Fuel reserves, telecommunications centers, repair workshops, and even ammunition bunkers were reduced to rubble. The intention was to leave Saddam's army with no real possibility of maneuver once the ground phase began. This pace of destruction generated in Baghdad a mixture of panic, disconnection, and resignation. Sirens sounded constantly, but the population was no longer sure whether to take shelter or continue with their routines. Water supply became irregular, hospitals began to collapse, and markets emptied. Meanwhile, Pentagon analysts debated whether it was necessary to physically eliminate Saddam, or if it was enough to destroy his command capability. The answer was never unanimous, but in practice, direct attacks on him were avoided. Instead, his security network and command centers that guaranteed the regime's continuity were targeted. Iraqi troops stationed in Kuwait, disconnected from the rear, began to suffer the effects of isolation. Their supply lines had been cut, communications interfered with, and the central command gave no coherent instructions, which led many soldiers to desert or surrender before the ground offensive began. Within the inner circle, the silence grew heavier. Some officers began to show signs of exhaustion and bewilderment, but no one dared to openly question Saddam's decisions. The reports that reached him were filtered, minimized, or simply ignored the real deterioration of the front. His strategy was based on the hope that the coalition would not advance beyond the bombings, or that some international pressure would halt the total invasion. However, when the first ground units crossed the border in February, there was no longer any margin for error. In barely 100 hours, the Allied forces destroyed a large part of the Iraqi units in Kuwait, recovered the territory, and forced the withdrawal of the remnants of the army. Images of charred convoys, abandoned tanks, and disoriented soldiers crossed screens worldwide. Although the regime remained standing, its permanence was not part of the coalition's official plans. The Allied forces withdrew without occupying the capital or modifying the command, although the defensive apparatus had been rendered inoperative. The population had been direct witnesses to the destruction. While the state issued no response, projectiles traversed the sky unimpeded, and the most feared army in the region was overcome without offering resistance. Saddam's image was still present, but the perception of his power had vanished. The impact of the conflict not only destroyed visible structures, it also dismantled the daily fabric of the capital. The streets were marked by the traces of the attack, services were interrupted, and state offices ceased to operate in wide areas. In the absence of formal management, the population began to organize in improvised ways to cover basic needs. The operational collapse was evident, but the leadership was not altered. From the most affected sectors, the general feeling was one of abandonment, with minimal signs of institutional response. The apparatus of power remained present, though immobile. The psychological effect of the war on Saddam was difficult to gauge from the outside. Some reports showed him more paranoid, others more determined, but the truth is that for weeks he avoided appearing in public, limiting himself to sending recorded messages or written communiques. His circle further narrowed, his movements became erratic, and his obsession with control intensified. No one could enter or leave without direct authorization, and any rumor of betrayal was enough to trigger reprisals. The city that had once represented the power of the Arab world was now a darkened capital, with its buildings bombed and its population broken. What had begun as an operation to liberate Kuwait had ended up becoming the greatest humiliation suffered by Iraq since its modern foundation, an open wound that neither forced silence nor subsequent speeches would manage to close. The besieged dictator, punishments, hunger, and internal betrayal. Following the withdrawal of foreign forces, Saddam regained control without changes occurring at the top. The army had lost cohesion, the state apparatus operated in a fragmented manner, and traces of the bombing were still visible on the main thoroughfares. The power-sustaining structure was neither replaced nor modified, and the head of the regime reappeared without showing any alterations in his stance. From that moment on, a phase marked by reprisals began, with no room for reforms or gestures of openness. Any attempt at reconciliation was discarded from the outset, and the response was immediate: widespread repression as a method of reassertion. In the southern provinces, where the Shiite population had begun to rise up, the army responded with a systematic offensive. Cities that showed signs of rebellion were surrounded and bombed indiscriminately. In Basra, tanks fired on entire neighborhoods while troops detained those attempting to flee. Mosques were occupied, clerics arrested, and young people identified as agitators were summarily executed. The morgues were not enough to contain the bodies, and local authorities received precise instructions to hide the real figures. In places like Karbala or Najaf, the destruction included sacred sites, but not even that stopped the generals sent from Baghdad. The repression continued for weeks until the pockets of insurrection were completely extinguished. In parallel, sanctions imposed by the United Nations began to paralyze the economy. Foreign trade was blocked, imports limited, and the financial system became isolated. The dinar plummeted in a matter of months, and the average salary ceased to cover even a small part of basic needs. The supply of medicines became unstable, and pharmacies sold empty containers just to maintain appearances. Diseases that were once easily treated began to spread, and in hospitals, doctors improvised with what little remained. In Baghdad's poorest neighborhoods, child malnutrition became common, but no channel could show it. Images of suffering were censored, and any mention of scarcity was punished as treason. While the population barely managed to sustain itself with what little arrived, the regime intensified its control without visible pauses. Surveillance extended through streets, offices, and homes, with networks that no longer sought information but active obedience. It was not enough to remain silent. It was necessary to demonstrate unwavering allegiance. Movement was restricted, calls monitored, and encounters between neighbors were reduced to brief exchanges under the shadow of suspicion. The figure of the head of state dominated every institutional gesture, not just as an imposed image, but as the obligatory core of everything said or done in public. Words were repeated without emphasis. Official acts followed a closed script, and any minimal hesitation was enough to trigger consequences. The defeat had not weakened the regime. It had made it more closed, more obsessive, and more determined to sustain itself with what it could still control. International attempts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis failed due to the rigidity of the regime. The Oil for Food program was approved under strict conditions, but its execution was controlled from the offices of the central power. Distributions were selective. Loyal areas received more supplies, suspicious regions were punished with reduced rations. Part of the funds were diverted to accounts controlled by the leadership. Oil was exchanged for goods, but also for favors. Clandestine trade networks were strengthened, and intermediaries close to the presidential family exploited the system to enrich themselves. While queues at distribution centers grew longer, Saddam's sons organized private parties with illegally imported products. The figure of the dictator remained omnipresent. Despite international isolation, he organized public events to appear firm and secure. In official acts, he appeared surrounded by officers and officials, although many of them no longer trusted the stability of the system and loyalties became fragile. In private, some members of the inner circle began to express reservations, but there were no visible ruptures. Saddam continued to use fear as his main tool. Cases of high-ranking officials arrested on vague suspicions increased. Some were executed without trial, others sent to secret prisons, and even members of his extended family began to fear for their safety. One of the most notorious cases was that of Hussein Kamel, the president's son-in-law, and a prominent figure in the military-industrial complex. In 1995, he fled to Jordan with his brother, and both offered to collaborate with international organizations, revealing details about the hidden weapons program. The impact was immediate, and Saddam remained silent for several days. When he finally reacted, he did so with an ambiguous strategy, as he publicly pretended that the betrayal had not affected him and declared that the defectors were free to return if they wished. Months later, when the Kamel brothers returned trusting the promises, they were assassinated in an ambush organized by members of their own tribe, and the message was clear. No disloyalty, no matter how close, would go unpunished. Tension within the military structure also grew. Some generals who had been key during the 1980s were displaced or degraded, and trust was no longer based on merit but on obedience. Young figures were promoted, many without real experience but with family or personal ties to the heads of intelligence services. Strategic decisions were made based on political control, not effectiveness. The Ministry of Defense was subordinated to security agencies, chains of command were fragmented, and the most capable units were placed near Baghdad, not to protect the country but to safeguard the regime. In the north, the situation was no less complex. The Kurdish region had achieved de facto autonomy after the war, protected by a no-fly zone, and the central authorities failed to impose their dominion. The void was exploited by local parties, but also by external actors, and Saddam responded with isolation. The Kurds were excluded from official programs, and any attempt at communication was channeled through unofficial emissaries. The division of the country was consolidated, although speeches reiterated that national unity was guaranteed. Territorial control was reduced, but control over the still dominated areas became more oppressive. Surveillance measures multiplied without pause. Monitoring systems in sensitive areas were strengthened, internal control archives were expanded, and new functions were assigned to the offices responsible for supervising civilian and military behavior. Every decision went through a hierarchical filter, and local initiative was replaced by the mechanical execution of central orders. The apparatus of power no longer delegated or corrected, it only observed and sanctioned. Despite the economic deterioration, Saddam did not reduce his security spending. The construction of palaces, shelters, and surveillance systems continued. In Baghdad, new administrative headquarters were erected, many empty or without clear function. In the desert, private residences were built far from the reach of spies or drones. Detention complexes were expanded, and new interrogation methods were designed. Some reports indicated the use of hidden cameras in government offices and officers' dormitories, although it was never officially confirmed. Paranoia was institutional, and nobody knew who was observing whom. The system was sustained not by its effectiveness, but by constant fear. On the diplomatic front, the regime tried to break the isolation through discreet contacts with foreign governments and companies. Some commercial delegations secretly visited Baghdad, and future oil contracts were offered in exchange for support in the Security Council. However, sanctions remained in force, and efforts failed to change the international image. At regional summits, Iraq's presence was symbolic. Historical allies of the past kept their distance, and the official narrative spoke of conspiracies, infiltrated enemies, internal traitors, and global betrayal. But none of that managed to reverse the growing isolation. Baghdad shatters, the final invasion and the total fall. The first armored columns crossed the border from Kuwait in complete darkness, escorted by reconnaissance vehicles and helicopters that illuminated the terrain every few minutes. The dust raised by the tanks hindered visibility, but the advance did not stop. Along the route to Baghdad, United States troops encountered scattered obstacles, some oil wells on fire, makeshift defensive positions, and imprecise artillery fire. The initial resistance was uneven, sometimes non-existent, other times fierce and localized. In some sections, the defenders seemed poorly coordinated, with contradictory orders and fractured chains of command. As the units advanced, they passed through intermediate cities without the need for prolonged combat. Iraqi forces dissolved or retreated before direct contact, and the regime's defensive strategy showed visible flaws. The Republican Guard remained stationed in key areas but failed to articulate a coherent defense of national territory. Previous air attacks had damaged critical infrastructure, affecting the logistics of the military command. Even so, there were points of friction at the accesses to the Euphrates, where brief but intense clashes with entrenched units took place. It was not a coordinated defense, but desperate acts to slow the advance. On the outskirts of Baghdad, bridges were guarded by reduced squadrons. Some were destroyed before being taken, others remained intact due to detonation failures or sudden surrenders. The entry into the city was preceded by precision bombing on command and communication centers. For days, the capital vibrated with the echo of controlled explosions. Nights were illuminated by flashes of guided missiles, and the sound of drones flying over the urban center became constant. The streets, without civilian traffic, were patrolled by poorly armed militiamen, and order had disintegrated without warning. The ground incursion into Baghdad was not preceded by a conventional battle. Reconnaissance units penetrated peripheral areas without direct opposition, and armored vehicles took key positions, such as road junctions, ministerial facilities, and regime residential complexes. In the most symbolic zones of power, defenses were scarce or non-existent. The system crumbled from within, checkpoints emptied, military uniforms appeared abandoned on sidewalks, and security offices were looted before being attacked. The chain of command evaporated in a matter of hours. In residential neighborhoods, the population remained motionless behind curtains or avoided looking out. The city unraveled in stages without signs of an articulated response. The first looting broke out after the withdrawal of officials. Police stations fell into the hands of the mob, ministries burned, and hospitals collapsed. At certain points, residents erected makeshift barriers with what they had on hand, not to confront anyone but to protect their own. The streets were covered with abandoned belongings and charred remains of official documents. The signal from the official channel was cut without warning. The last images broadcast were pre-recorded messages, and no one appeared to take control of public discourse. Disorganization spread through entire neighborhoods without a structure emerging capable of containing it. The electrical grid stopped operating, and only some hotels powered by private generators offered shelter to foreigners who had not been able to leave. Diplomatic delegations closed quickly, while banking establishments were invaded by groups seeking cash. Internal transport, communications, and any form of administrative activity were paralyzed without coordination. In less than 7 days, Baghdad ceased to function as an active and visible capital. In the midst of that void, rumors began to circulate about Saddam's departure. Some claimed to have seen him in convoys heading north. Others spoke of underground tunnels or helicopters that took off during dawn, but no one offered confirmations. The party leadership vanished from the public space without leaving visible instructions. The president's statues were toppled with improvised tools in front of cameras recording the scene for international networks. The Ba'ath Party offices were looted by their own neighbors. Official photographs disappeared from the walls, and the portrait of the supreme leader, present for decades on every corner, turned into worthless residue. In the governmental complexes, the corridors remained empty. In the basements, shredded documents, archives still in flames, and dust-covered tape recorders were found. The official residences were uninhabited. In some, suits still hanging, intact tableware, and telephones that continued to receive calls that no one answered were found. The swimming pools were full of debris, and the gardens withered under the sun, without gardeners or surveillance. The apparatus of power, which had functioned as a rigid machinery for decades, broke down without showing signs of organized internal resistance. The urban control system evaporated. Civil security forces abandoned their posts. Weapons were left behind or resold in improvised markets, and some police stations were converted into looters' warehouses. The prisons were left without custodians, releasing hundreds of common detainees. In the following days, armed gangs began to patrol entire sectors, and there was no visible authority. The population organized into self-protection cells, setting up checkpoints with furniture, piles of stones, or abandoned vehicles. Domestic violence increased, hospitals were overwhelmed, and ambulances were requisitioned by armed groups who imposed their own rules. The taking of Baghdad was not a confrontation, it was a fading away. The regime's units withdrew without explanation, buildings were left empty before anyone occupied them, and central offices stopped issuing orders. The city, without defense or management, began to fragment from within. Educational centers closed without warning, universities were left open to looting, and public archives disappeared without resistance. In museums and libraries there was no longer any staff, and what was not stolen ended up destroyed. Meanwhile, US forces took positions at the main entrances without interfering with the chaos spreading through the neighborhoods, patrolled key areas, set up checkpoints, and observed the institutional collapse without intervening in local disputes. The capital remained standing, but it did not respond. There was no official voice, no instructions, no sign of continuity, no one organized anything. The regime broke down without warning, and what remained was a city brought to a halt, disconnected from itself, and without an authority that could take on what had been exposed. The last prisoner, between the cage, the soldiers, and the final silence. For months, the traces leading to Saddam Hussein's whereabouts seemed to fade among endless deserts, villages sealed by fear, and corridors known only to his most loyal bodyguards. When he was finally found, he was not among opulent walls or under formal military protection, but inside a hole dug underground, which was accessed by lifting a concrete slab next to an empty hut. Access to that hiding place required crouching among cables, dust, and absolute silence. The man who had led a country for decades was captured without resistance, disoriented and with a beard that covered half of his face. There were no speeches or threats, only an opaque gaze laden with the past. After his arrest, he was not taken to a common prison or an immediate judicial center. He was housed in a special facility prepared exclusively for his confinement. It was a spacious cell by military standards, with a simple mattress, a metal chair, and a lamp that remained lit day and night. The walls, unadorned, offered no distractions. The former ruler ate alone under surveillance and was supervised by a small group of American soldiers, rotated strategically to prevent any emotional bond or shared habit. Distance was a mandate, although the constant routine gradually wore down the imposed barriers. Every morning he woke up early, washed himself with a bucket of water and rationed soap, and walked in circles within the permitted space. Sometimes he was offered a copy of the Quran, other times paper to write. His notes were reviewed before being removed, many without it ever being known if they were sent or archived. The tone was always neutral, without demands or pleas, and surveillance remained intact. Cameras recorded every movement, microphones picked up every sound, and any contact with the outside had to pass through multiple filters. The soldiers who took turns guarding him were young, many of them without prior experience with historical or political figures. Not all of them knew how to act in front of him. Some treated him like any detainee, others maintained a tense but respectful posture. He was never beaten or assaulted, but he also received no privileges. He was a prisoner under direct custody, without uniforms or visible charges, without official status. The cell was kept clean, the air conditioning worked without interruptions, and the food was simple but regular. During the day, the silence was almost absolute. He was not allowed to interact with other prisoners or move freely outside his assigned space. Sometimes he looked through the small ventilation slit as if trying to identify some sign from the outside world. Other times he remained seated, motionless, for hours, and that muteness was only broken when the medical round arrived or security protocols were updated. The detainee's body language changed over time. At first he was rigid and wary. With the days his posture became more relaxed, though without falling into familiarities. The place where he was held was not a conventional penitentiary. It had been installed inside a military base, surrounded by double walls and continuous patrols. Authorized personnel were limited, and all access required multiple authorizations. Even his minimal belongings, a change of clothes, a blanket, a toothbrush without a handle, were counted daily. There was no room for error. Any conversation he had with the soldiers was brief, contained, focused on logistical aspects. He would ask the time, ask for paper or comment on the weather, but never mentioned the past. During the nights, surveillance was reinforced. The light remained on and the noise of the generator created a dense atmosphere. Sometimes he spoke to himself in a low voice, repeating phrases in Arabic that were not always understood. Other times he recited religious verses. He showed no evident signs of emotional deterioration nor expressed remorse. He merely maintained a routine that repeated without variations, slept little and ate slowly, and the changing of the guard marked the rhythm of his days. The more veteran soldiers noticed that despite the environment, he maintained some habits of personal dignity. He combed his hair carefully, folded his clothes with precision, and avoided showing weakness. Even under the constant gaze of his custodians, he maintained an upright posture and a firm tone. He asked for no explanations, nor showed anxiety, seeming to understand that the stage he was living was beyond his control. His life was limited to one room, one schedule, and the gaze of young people who had not lived his era of power. Decisions about his treatment were made by a small circle of high-ranking officials. The conditions of his confinement, behavioral reports, and security measures were periodically reviewed. The objective was not to punish or provoke, but to maintain a controlled neutrality. He was not granted visits, nor was he allowed to issue public statements or send political messages. He was officially a detainee under preventive custody, but in practice he was a symbol enclosed in a meticulously administered silence. As the weeks passed, the soldiers rotated, the conditions were slightly adjusted, but the essence of the confinement remained intact. The figure who had once governed with a firm hand, who dominated platforms, media, and armies, now walked in circles inside a windowless room, where time was not measured in speeches or decisions, but in food trays, surveillance rounds, and notebooks full of phrases that no one read. What remained of Saddam Hussein were not orders, nor weapons, nor followers. It was a confined presence, suspended between history and the judgment that had not yet arrived. The last day. On the 30th of December, still in the early morning, the armored vehicle transporting Saddam Hussein stopped in front of a concrete block in the Kadhimiya complex, where Iraqi government agents in civilian clothes took custody and handed over the legal order to the officer in charge, who, after reviewing the documentation, allowed entry to the premises. In another room, designated witnesses awaited, among them a judge, forensic doctors, and Ministry of Justice officials, prepared to certify each step of the process. In a nearby room, 3 hooded men silently awaited with their assigned task, without showing their faces or uttering a word. Saddam was led down a narrow corridor to the wooden platform installed on a concrete base, with a rectangular trapdoor in the center, a metallic ladder to the side, and to the left, the railing that supported the mechanism. 2 guards held him by the arms and made him ascend while another prepared the rope. The condemned man ascended with a firm step, without resistance and with his gaze fixed forward. Once in position, one of the hooded men adjusted the noose around his neck, another checked the length to ensure an immediate fall, and an official read aloud the execution record with his name and the order signed by the judicial authority, after which the doctor approached, took his pulse, checked his vital signs, and gave the signal to continue. Those present took their positions. The person in charge turned the steel lever, the trapdoor opened, and the body dropped abruptly, the rope tightened immediately, and there was no movement. The doctor descended the auxiliary ladder, observed the face, applied clinical tests, and confirmed the total absence of vital signs. With that certification, a team dismantled the rope, placed the body on a metallic gurney, and covered it with a white cloth, transporting it along the same corridor to the room designated for post-mortem examination, where forensic experts took samples, recorded official photographs, drafted the cause of death in technical terms, and precisely noted the time of death, closing the record with the mandatory signatures of each responsible party. Outside, a caravan awaited instructions. 2 vehicles approached the entrance, and the body was promptly loaded into one of them, while a ministry official carried the documents in the back seat. The convoy advanced without interruptions, passing through several checkpoints that verified identity and route, until reaching the previously agreed point, where tribal representatives received the body under strict supervision, signed the official receipt, and accepted the imposed conditions. The burial was to be immediate and discreet, without ceremony. In an isolated space, the grave was dug under surveillance, the coffin was deposited without a visible marker, and only a small group of witnesses observed the closing, without speeches, without press, and without external access. In parallel, within the governmental offices, a report detailing the chronological procedure from handover to burial was drafted and confidentially archived in the Ministry of Interior. The structure used for the execution was dismantled, the pieces transferred to an unidentified depot, the room was closed, and the next day, the marks were covered with fresh cement and paint, sealing the premises and prohibiting access by official order. That same day, local media disseminated the official confirmation in a brief statement, while low-quality leaked images circulated without authorization. Abroad, limited reactions were issued, with short diplomatic communiques without tributes or broad pronouncements. Within Iraq, in some cities, there were spontaneous celebrations, in others silence prevailed, and in areas with residual sympathies for the old regime, security was reinforced for fear of disturbances. National press organizations received instructions to change programming starting the following day. Schools and public offices continued with their routines, and authorities did not offer new statements. In the internal archives, the folder with the complete file was sealed with date and confidential code, under restricted custody and without possibility of external consultation. The recordings remained under control of national intelligence. The rope used was destroyed and the trapdoor definitively sealed. The place where it occurred was painted and closed, without a plaque or sign to commemorate it. With the passing of the weeks, contradictory versions circulated, but the government avoided responding, and when asked in international forums, spokespersons repeated the same formula. The procedure was carried out under the legal framework and is closed. The execution of Saddam Hussein marked the closing of a cycle of violence that had shaped Iraq for decades. It was presented as justice for those who had suffered his orders, but in reality it did not alleviate the wounds nor erase the trace of pain he left behind. That death, far from being absolutely horrible, was quick and controlled. That design of harm was used to feign strength, although in comparison with what he imposed on thousands of families and people who faced the impossible, it ended up being a brief end. It did not balance the magnitude of his crimes, nor restore calm to those who had carried the weight of terror. Even with his fall, the suffering continued, sustained by years of war, hunger, and repression. The image of the fallen dictator was not enough to close the history of a torn country.